Welcome back to the Bootcamp series. Congratulations on making it to part 3. I think this video should be a lot of fun because now at this point you and I speak the same language. Or I should say languages. We both speak the basics of HTML and CSS. Meaning at this point it's going to be less about the technology and syntax and more about designing something that actually looks good. So in our previous video we learned the basics of CSS. And this allowed us to add color and control the font size, so on and so forth. But we still had a very 1990s looking layout where it was just single column and every element took up the full available width. Instead, we want multiple pieces of content to be able to sit side by side together. So here's a sneak peek preview of the finished product of what we're going to build together. I think we can all agree this looks a lot better than the page I created in the previous lesson. Anyways, without further ado, let's jump into the action. So we just saw the finished product, but now it's time to build it together. So let's start from scratch. I want you to follow along with me. From the CodePen website, let's start coding or create a new pen. Okay, so we have a completely empty canvas. Let's get started. Let me look at the reference design. So let's focus on this dark purple area up top first. Essentially, it contains our logo text in the left corner and then a few navigation links in the right corner. So let's write the HTML for that. So I will start with a heading level 1 that says our logo. And then below that, I'll have an unordered list with those few navigation links. So UL for unordered list. Inside it, I'll have each one be a list item. And let's see, the 3 links were home, about, and portfolio. Now in HTML, to create a link that you can click on to go to a new page, you use the A element, which stands for anchor. So A tab. The href value is where you would go if you actually clicked on the link. We're not going to actually set up any separate pages, so I'm just going to have a placeholder hashtag value. Okay, but then in between the opening and closing A tags, that's where you include the actual text that you click on. So let's say home. And then I'm just going to copy and paste that line for the 2 other links. So they were about and portfolio. Okay, so down here we see that we have the raw content. Now let's start worrying about the actual design. So for example, we noticed that the top header area should have a dark purple background color. Or in other words, we don't just want the entire page to be dark purple. We just want that top section with both the logo text and the links to be purple. Now, in order to group these 2 things together, right, the logo and the list, I'm going to introduce you to a new element type in HTML. So check this out. Up at the very top of our HTML, I want you to type div. So D-I-V, and then hit tab. So we now have an empty div element. Div stands for division, so you can think of it as a section of the page. And now we can drop down, right? So we have an opening tag and closing tag, and now we can nest other content inside it. So what I'm going to do is just select both the heading level 1 and the unordered list and just cut that into my clipboard and then just paste it to live inside the div. Now in terms of staying organized, you can see the indentation got messed up when I pasted that. So to fix that, you can just click this arrow here and click Format HTML. So now notice it properly indented the list to show that it is nested or that it lives inside the div. Anyways, the reason we created this div is now we can give it the dark purple background color. Let me show you what I mean. So on that opening div tag, we can give it a class. So class equals quotes. We can make up any name we want, but why don't we call it header? Okay, and then in our CSS column, we just want to target that class of header. So to target a class, you begin with a dot or period and then the matching name. So dot, header, curly brackets, and let's say background dash color, colon. And now I want you to type this color value in with me, and then in just a moment I can show you where it came from. But let's say hashtag 283593 and then end the line with a semicolon. Now if we take a look at the preview, notice the entire page is not the dark purple, but just sort of this area that has both our header and our navigation links. Now really quick, before we move on and adjust the layout of this content, I did want to show you where I got this color from. So we already learned that you can Google for color picker and choose any color you want, but sometimes you could use a little bit of inspiration or help choosing an exact color. So in a new tab, if you search for material design colors, you should be able to find this page. It should be the first result. And then if you scroll down towards the very bottom of this page, you'll see all of these different colors that you can choose from. So in particular, for this design, I chose this indigo color, and then it gives me all of these different shades or variations of that color. And here are their hexadecimal color codes. So I just chose different shades of this color for our design. So that's where the colors came from, in case you were wondering. Okay, let's get back to the task at hand. Right, we're trying to make this content look like this. So first, let's make both our logo and our links white so we can actually read them against this dark purple background. And then let's worry about having them sit side by side. So within our CSS, within this header rule, we can just add a new line and say color, colon, and then you could just say white, or the hexadecimal color code is hashtag and then 6 Fs. Now, since this particular color code is just repeating, you actually don't need the final 3 Fs. You can just say hashtag FFF. Okay, so that changed the color of our header and the bullets for the bulleted list, but the actual links are still blue. To change the color of a link, you need to target them specifically instead of targeting their parent and expecting it to trickle down. So why don't we go ahead and give our unordered list a class. So on the UL tag, let's say class equals navigation, or let's just say nav for short. Okay, then let's create a new rule and say .nav space and then a curly brackets. Now this is a new type of selector that we did not see in the previous lesson. This is called a descendant selector. So first of all, this .nav, that's a class selector. We're familiar with that, but then we added a space, and now essentially we're just saying we want to select any A elements that live inside or are nested inside an element with a class of nav. Okay, but inside this rule, we can just say color, hashtag FFF. Next, we don't want the links to be underlined, right? If we look at the reference design, these links do not have underlines. So when you're selecting an A element, you can just say text-decoration, none. Okay, next, let's remove the bulleted icons. So to do that, I'm going to create a new rule, say .nav, right? That's our overall unordered list element, and then just say curly brackets, and then say list-style, none. Okay, and while we're at it in this rule, I also don't want this margin or indentation on the list. So within this same rule, I can just say margin, 0, and padding, 0. Okay, now this is starting to look a little better, but we still have the situation where each piece of content is sitting on its own line. So this is where we get to the interesting part of the lesson, right? If we look at the reference design, we want the navigation links to sit on the same line as our logo element. So how can we make that happen? Well, remember, we created a div with a class of header, and both of those two elements live within that div. So check this out. Up at the top of our CSS, when we are selecting the header div, or just any element that has a class of header, after our background color and color, but still in those curly brackets, let's add a new declaration, and let's say display flex semicolon. Aha, this is what we wanted. The header and list are now sitting side by side. So essentially, when you tell a parent element to use display flex, it's going to try to align all of its direct children elements to be on a single line. Now that is what we want, right? Them on a single line, but we don't want the navigation link to be right up against the header. Instead, we'd want the navigation link to sit on the right edge. So check this out. On our parent element here, right after display flex, we can just say justify-content, and then give it a value of space-between, semicolon. Perfect. So now any of the remaining available space will be placed in between the direct children. So for example, if we had a third direct child of that header element, so if I had a paragraph here that just said, hey, Well, you can see it's placed in the middle. So the parent is distributing the remaining space evenly between our different pieces of content. So we don't actually want that paragraph. Let me get rid of that. Okay, next, we don't want the navigation links to sit one by one. Instead, we want those to sit side by side as well. So check this out. In our CSS, we already have a rule where we're targeting the navigation UL, right, the unordered list element. So within that rule, we can just say display : flex. Perfect. This works because if we look at the UL, well, all of its direct children are the list item elements. So it's going to attempt to align them all on a single line. Next, notice that the header is taller than the links. So the header appears to be centered, but the links are up in the top corner. So instead, we'd want the links to be vertically centered within the parent element. To do this, we just go back up to our header rule, right? Because that's the overall parent element that's aligning both the header and the list. And right after this justify content declaration, we can just say align-items : center. Perfect. Essentially, this property controls the alignment along the primary axis, so horizontal by default, and then this property controls things along the secondary axis, so by default that's vertical. Now when we set the display value to flex, this is a topic in CSS known as Flexbox, and these are Flexbox related properties. Now Flexbox is an incredibly deep topic, and you could create a 20-part video series just on Flexbox. But I want to keep this particular lesson moving forward. So that's all we're going to cover on Flexbox in this video. However, remember when I said you could create a 20-part series just on Flexbox? Well, the brilliant Wes Boss has already done exactly that. So in the description of this video, you'll find a link to some of my favorite videos on YouTube where you can learn more about Flexbox and Flexbox related properties. I've also created an entire video on YouTube just dedicated to Flexbox. So if you're super interested in aligning content, be sure to check those links out. Anyways, let's keep moving forward with our design. So next, I want to get rid of this awkward white border or edge we see around the content. Right? If we look at the finished product, the dark purple header sits flush against the edges of the web browser. So to fix that in our case, up in the CSS, up at the very top, let's just create a new rule where we target the overall body element, which is sort of the page as a whole, and just tell it to have margin 0. Cool, so now our purple header sits flush against the browser edge. Next, why don't we add a bit of horizontal padding to our purple header so that our content doesn't sit up against the very far horizontal edges. So within our header rule, let's just add a new declaration, say padding : and let's say 45px, semicolon. Now, I think that looks good horizontally, but that's way too much extra padding vertically. So we have a few different ways we could handle this. Instead of applying padding in all 4 directions, top, right, bottom, and left, we could just say padding - left 45 pixels and padding - right 45 pixels, right? And that does the job. Or there's also something called shorthand in CSS where we could say padding : and then just work in a clockwise direction. So on the top, we don't want any. And then going in clockwise motion, the next corner would be the right edge, so 45 pixels. On the bottom, 0. And on the left, 45px. Right, so clockwise, top, right, bottom, left. Or better yet, we could just say padding 0, 45px. So when you provide just 2 values, the first is used for the vertical top and bottom, and this is used for the horizontal values. Okay, next, why don't we add a bit of horizontal spacing in between the different nav links? So I'd probably write a new CSS rule that targets any list item inside of our list. So down at the bottom here, I'd create a new rule, say .nav, look inside it for any list items, curly brackets, and I'd probably just say margin -left 20px. Cool. Next, let's use a custom font instead of this browser default Times New Roman. So in a new tab, if you visit fonts.google.com, the font that I'm going to search for is named Source Sans Pro, Here it is, so I'm just going to click on that. Out of all of the different weights and styles, I will choose the regular 400, and then I'll choose italic, and then instead of semi-bold, I'll jump down and choose the bold 700. And I don't need the bold italic because how often will I really use that? And the fewer font styles you include, the quicker the download will be for our visitors. So just regular italic and bold, then I can click embed. Okay, then I'm going to select this bit of HTML that it gives me, copy that into my clipboard, back in CodePen, up at the very top of our HTML area, just paste it in. Okay, now I want to use that custom font globally on my page, so within my body rule in CSS, I'll just say font-family, quotes, source, sans pro, comma, sans serif. Cool, I think that looks a lot better. Next, let's add a hover effect for when you mouse over one of these navigation links. If we look at the reference design, you can see that they turn purple, a very light purple, and they sort of rotate a tiny bit clockwise. So to make that happen, let's start with the color change. So to begin, let's find the CSS rule for those A elements. So we already have a rule for nav space A. Right below that, let's make a new rule. Let's say dot nav space A, and this is the important part, colon hover, and then curly brackets. So the colon hover attached to the A is our way of saying only apply these styles when this element is being hovered. So now we can just say color colon, let's go with hashtag C5CAE9. Let's test this out. Perfect. Let's also animate or transition them a bit so they rotate a little bit clockwise when you hover. So in this same hover rule, let's add a new declaration and say transform colon rotate and then a pair of parentheses. And let's just say 6 degrees. So 6 DEG. Be sure to end the line with a semicolon. Now I believe on its own that won't do anything. And that's because we need to tell the base rule, so just the nav A rule, we need to tell them to be a block level element. So display block. Now if we try to hover over, cool, you can see they rotate. However, we don't just want them to go from not rotated at all to fully rotated in 1 millisecond. Instead, we would want it to gradually sort of transition or animate. So on this rule where we just said display block for the nav A, not the hover rule, but just the base A rule, let's say transition colon, and let's just transition all properties over the course of 0.3 seconds. And instead of the animation occurring at a linear rate, let's say ease out. So it sort of gradually slows down towards the end of the animation. So now if we test this out, cool. I think that looks nice. At this point, our dark purple header area is complete. So let's change gears and look at the reference design. And now let's start working on this area. So right away, I noticed that it uses a light purple background color. And so we don't want the entire body of our document to be this purple color. So what I'm getting at is we're going to want a div element to store the headline, the paragraph, and this button link, right? And that way the overall div element can have this light purple background color. Let me show you what I have in mind. So let's jump back into our HTML. Okay, and after our unordered list navigation and even after this closing div tag for our purple header, so below that, let's just add a brand new div. So div and then tab on our keyboard. And let's give it a class of, so class equals quotes. We could name it anything, but why don't we name it hero? Okay, now inside the div, let's have a heading level 1, so h1 tab, and say welcome to our site. Below that, let's have a paragraph, so p tab, and why don't we just say lorem and then hit tab for a bit of placeholder text. And then below that p, let's have a link, so you can just hit a and then tab. For the href value, let's just say hashtag or placeholder. Inside the opening and closing a tags, let's say learn more. Okay, let's take a look at the preview. So there's the raw content. Now it's our job to turn this into this. So let's start with the light purple background color. let's write a new bit of CSS. So down at the bottom of my CSS, I'll create a brand new rule and target, so dot hero, right? I want to select that new div, curly brackets. Let's say background dash color colon hashtag C5 CAE9 semicolon. Okay, and while we're at it, let's also give this div a bit of vertical and horizontal padding, right? So that way the content doesn't sit up against the edge. So right after background color, let's just say padding colon. Let's give it 60 pixels vertically and 45 pixels horizontally. Okay, so that gives us this, and I just zoomed out a lot to simulate viewing this on a large desktop monitor. I did this because I want to bring your attention to a very important point. So let's take our paragraph, for example. Well, the human eye does not want to read this many words per line. It's very fatiguing on your eyes to have to scan this far across without a break where you get to drop down to a new line. This is why if we look at the reference design, I did not let this content just span the full available width of the screen. Instead, you'll notice I'm centering it horizontally in the middle. So let me show you how we can set that up. Now our first instinct might be to go into our hero rule and just say width 600px, right? And you'll notice that does restrict the content to be 600 pixels wide. So now the human eye can read this text a bit easier. However, we absolutely do want the light purple background to take up the full space. We just don't want the interior content to take up the full space. So let me show you what I would do. In our HTML, within our hero div, I would just select the H1, the P, and the A, so all of the content inside the div. Let's temporarily cut that into our clipboard so we can get it back in just a moment. Okay, and then directly inside the hero div, let's just have a second div. So div tab, and let's give it a class of, so class equals quotes. Let's call it hero-inner. You could name it anything, that's just what I'm calling it. Okay, and then in between those opening and closing div tags, just paste in your clipboard. Okay, so now let me show you what we can do. So we don't want to restrict the hero to a certain width. So back in our CSS, let's get rid of this width 600 pixels on the hero. Cool, so now the light purple takes up the full width just like we want. And now let's just create a new rule. So a brand new rule, dot hero-inner, curly brackets. And this is where we can say width, let's go with 760px. Cool, so I just zoomed out again. So now we have the best of both worlds, right? The light purple takes up the full width, but our actual content is in that inner nested wrapper or inner div, and it just takes up a reasonable amount of space. So the human eye can actually read one of these lines of text, and then it wraps down to a new line. However, if you remember in the reference design, this content here should be horizontally centered within its parent container. Well, to achieve that, we can just use Flexbox. So check this out. On our hero rule, not hero inner, but just hero, let's say display flex. Okay, now that on its own won't do anything, but if we also say justify-content center, well, that gives us exactly what we want. Now before we begin styling this content, right, we want to make the Learn More button look like this, and also make a few adjustments to the text here. Before we get to that, I do want to point out something very important when it comes to mobile devices like phones or small tablets. And that is, so if I zoom back into a normal ratio, well, we set the inner width to be 760 pixels. However, what if someone's device is not even wide enough to display 760 pixels? So if I zoom in super far in my browser to simulate a small device like a smartphone, notice that we see a horizontal scroll bar. Now, as a web designer, I would say 95% of the time, we want to avoid horizontal scroll bars at all costs. The reason this is occurring is because the device size is less than 760 pixels. So when we gave that inner div that width, well, it's now forcing horizontal scrolling. Let me show you how we can fix this, right? Because we absolutely don't want users on smartphones to have to scroll horizontally to look at our content. So what we can do on our hero inner, instead of giving it a width of that amount, we can just change this property to be max dash width. So big picture, we just change this from width to max width. So that gives us the same effect on screens that are large enough to actually display 760 pixels. However, if I zoom in again to simulate a tiny device, notice we don't have the horizontal scroll bar. So this lets the content squish down to be whatever size it needs to be to fit in a tiny viewport. So this is great. But by saying max width, we're saying that even on a super large desktop monitor, you're not allowed to be larger than 760 pixels. Okay, moving forward, let's begin styling this actual text content here. Let's start with the heading. So in the reference design, notice that headline is not bold. So back in our code, in the CSS, I'll just add a new rule down at the very bottom. So I'll begin by selecting our hero div, and then I want to look inside it for any heading level ones, curly brackets, and let's just say font weight normal, right? We don't want it to be bold. Let's give it a custom size, so font dash size for rem, semicolon, and I don't want there to be a ton of space vertically between it and the text below, so I'll just say margin 0. Okay, looking good. Let's focus on this paragraph text here. So in our CSS, I'll add a brand new rule. So dot hero, and then look inside that for any paragraph elements, curly brackets. I will increase the font size a little bit, so font dash size. Now 1 rem is the standard or default size. So if I want to increase it just a little bit, I can say maybe 1.18 rem. Okay, looks good. However, what if I want to increase the spacing in between each line of text? Right, so within the paragraph as it wraps down to new lines, how do we control the vertical spacing? Well, we can just say line dash height, and I'll give it a value of 1.6. Cool, so now you can see there's a bit more spacing in between each line, and I think it makes it easier for the human eye to read a large block of text this way. I will point out that line height is a bit unique in the sense that we do not need a unit of measurement after the number. So it's not 1.6 pixels or rem, it's just 1.6. So you could set it to anything you want. Instead of 1.6, I could say 2.5. And notice now the text is very spaced out. I think 1.6 is a nice happy medium. Okay, next, let's focus on the Learn More link. Now in the reference design, we want that to sort of look like a button instead of just a bit of plain blue text that's underlined. So first, let's ask ourselves, how would we want to select that element in our CSS? I wouldn't just want to select any link inside the header, because what if we had a link in this paragraph of text? So instead, I'd want to give this maybe a specific class. So in our HTML, here's that Learn More link. Let's just give it a class of, so class equals quotes, maybe just button. You can choose any name you want, but you just need to remember it. Okay, now over in our CSS, let's create a brand new rule that targets dot button, curly brackets. So if we look at the reference design, let's start by giving it a dark purple background color. So inside button, background dash color, colon, hashtag 3949AB. Okay, instead of the text being blue, let's make it white. So color, colon, hashtag FFF. Let's remove the underline of the text. So text, decoration, colon, none. Let's give it a bit of padding so the background color expands a bit beyond just the text edge. So padding, colon, let's say 12 pixels vertically and maybe 20 pixels horizontally. Okay, let's round the edges. So instead of just a harsh rectangle, they're curved or rounded a little bit. So we can say border dash radius, colon, let's try 8 pixels. Cool, I think that looks nice. Why don't we bump up the font size just a little bit so it matches this paragraph text? So we can say font size 1.18 rem. Okay, and finally, I'm noticing that there should be more of a vertical gap between the paragraph and our button. Now, by default, Paragraphs in HTML do have margin vertically. However, the reason we're not seeing it here is because A elements or link elements by default are inline level elements instead of block level elements. Essentially, a block level element is just something that takes up the full available space and is regarded as something that should sit on a new line by default. However, a link is not like that, right? Because you would maybe want a link in the middle of a paragraph block of text, and you wouldn't want that link to cause a line break. So that's why the paragraph is not able to successfully have its margin bottom pushed down before this link element begins. However, in our CSS for that link button, if we just say display block, well, notice now we do have a bit of a vertical gap between the paragraph and the link, but because this is now a block level element, it tries to take up the full available width. So to get around this, we can say display inline dash block. This is great in situations where you want an element to respond to the vertical margin of its neighbors, but you don't want it to take up the full available width. It's sort of a hybrid between inline and block. Okay, at this point we've completed this light purple area. Let's look at the reference design. So at this point, let's change gears and start working on this area. If I scroll down to the very bottom, you'll see that the footer area has a white background, and this area actually has a super light purple background. Also, if I zoom out to simulate a larger desktop monitor, notice that we don't want the content to be spread out across the full width, which might be hard for the human eye to scan across on a large monitor. Instead, we want to center it in this middle, maybe 1200 pixels at the max. But we do want the full width of this area to have that light purple background color. So let's get started. Back in our HTML in CodePen, down below all of our other HTML, let's create a brand new div. So div, hit tab. Let's give it a class. Class equals quotes. You could name it anything, but let's name it features. And then inside it, let's have another div, and its job will be to limit the maximum width. So div tab, let's give this a class of, so class equals quotes, features dash inner. Okay, now inside that div, let's start adding multiple features. So if we look at the reference design, I'm just considering each one of these a feature. So each one is just a div that has both a heading and then a paragraph. So back in our HTML, inside this inners div, let's just say div, hit tab. Let's give this a class of maybe featured dash item. And then inside it, let's have a heading level 3, so h3 tab, and say cool feature number 1. And then below that, let's have a paragraph. Inside the p tag, just say lorem. Okay, and then let's just copy and paste and duplicate this featured item div, right? Because if we look at the reference design, we want 9 of them, right? 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. So I'll just select the div with the class of featured item. Here's the closing. Copy that into my clipboard, and then below it, just hit paste. Below that, hit paste. And then we can change the numbers here. So cool feature number 1, this should be cool feature number 2, and cool feature number 3. For good measure, let's add another one just so we have at least 4 featured items. So it would be after this innermost div, there should still be these 2 closing divs for the 2 wrappers. And then right here, just paste in one final one, and let's say cool feature number 4. Okay, so now if we look at our preview area, here is that raw content. So now let's add the super light purple background color to the entire area. Then we want to center all of it sort of in this middle area. And then finally, we want to set up a 3-column layout for the features, right? As opposed to the default behavior of each div just taking up the full available width. Let's get started. So first, let's begin with the light purple background color for this entire area. So at the very bottom of my CSS code, I'll create a brand new rule and say dot features, curly brackets. Let's say background dash color colon hashtag E8EAF6 semicolon. Cool, there we can see the light purple taking up the full available space. Let's give that div a bit of padding. So I'll say padding, maybe 60 pixels vertically and 45 pixels horizontally. Okay, next, now let's focus on that inner div so that instead of this content taking up the full space, even on a wide monitor, instead, maybe we'd only want it to take up sort of this middle area right about here. So in our CSS, let's create a new rule and target .features-inner, curly brackets. Let's say max width, let's go with 1200 pixels. Okay, now that on its own does restrict this area, but we would want this to be centered horizontally instead of left aligned. Now we did see earlier that you can use Flexbox to center something horizontally. However, in this case, since it's just a simple layout of one item that we want to center, I'll show you a really simple way. So we don't even need to worry about the parent item. We can just target the exact item that we want to be centered. Right after max width, we can just say margin 0 auto. So this is the vertical value, this is the horizontal value. And if you give both the left margin and right margin a value of auto, that will horizontally center it. Cool, so now even on a super wide monitor, it's only going to take up sort of this middle portion of the screen, but it's flexible and it won't cause horizontal scrolling on small devices. At this point, let's get to the truly interesting point of this entire lesson, and let's learn how to set up sort of this 3-column layout that we see in the reference design. Now to achieve this 3-column layout, we absolutely could use Flexbox if we wanted to. However, I think there's an even better tool for the job, and it's something in CSS called Grid. So check this out. Back in our code pen, we're going to focus on this div with the class of features-inner because it is the direct parent of all of the elements that we want to align as columns. So do this with me. Within our CSS, within the rule for features-inner, let's add a new declaration that says display : grid. Okay, now that on its own doesn't do anything, but check this out. If we also say a new declaration, grid template columns, and those words are separated by dashes, so it's grid dash template dash columns, colon, and let's just say 300 px and then a space and then 200 px, semicolon. Well, take a look at what's going on. So essentially our first item is taking up 300 pixels of width, and then our second item is taking up 200 pixels of width. Now in our grid template code here for columns, we only listed 2 values, so then our third and fourth items, they just start over, right? So the third item takes up the 300 pixels, and then this one takes up the 200 pixels. If this doesn't make sense yet, that's okay. Instead of this value of 300 px and 200 px, what if we said 33% space 33% space 33%? Well, now all of the direct children, they're each going to take up 33% of the width, 33%, 33%, and then the fourth item, since we only listed 3 columns here, right? The 3 values represent 3 columns. Our fourth item or fourth div, it just starts in that first slot for each row. If we wanted all 4 of them to sit on a single line, we could say 25% and just spell that out 4 times. There we have it. Okay, so the idea is you can get really creative and you can achieve any sort of column layout you want. If you say 25% space 75%, well, it's going to use whatever split or ratio you describe, and then your next set of items are just going to be automatically placed into that grid for each row. Now, in our case, if we look at the reference design, we want a 3-column layout. So our first instinct might be to go with the 33%, 33%, and 33%. However, that doesn't leave any space for margin in between each column, right? Because we're already taking up 99% of the width. So for example, if we add another declaration of grid dash column dash gap, colon, and let's say 45 pixels, well, that does indeed give us a 45 pixel gap in between each column, but notice now I have the dreaded horizontal scroll bar. You might not see that horizontal scroll bar if you're on a large desktop monitor, but if you zoom in your browser by pressing Control+ or Command+, you can simulate a smaller screen and you'll see the horizontal scroll bar. It's because our columns alone were already taking up 99% of the available width, and then we tried to add in this 45 pixel gap, and 2 instances of that, so that's 45 plus 45, that's 90 pixels. So we just went over our budget, you could say, of 100% of the available width. That's why we created this horizontal scrolling situation, which we want to avoid at all costs. Now, luckily for us, there is a magical unit of measurement besides pixels or percentages that's going to save the day here. So check this out. For our grid template columns value, let's get rid of the 33% value, and instead I want you to say 1FR and then a space, 1FR, and even just with 2 of them, you can see that it's going to evenly distribute the space. So if we wanted a 3 column, we would just include one more, 1FR. So FR is a fraction unit, and essentially 1 is sort of the baseline or equal width value. It means that it's going to take up 1 equal part of the available space. So for example, if we gave this first one a value of 2FR, you can see that now it's going to take up twice as much space as these other ones, right? Or if we set this to 3FR, now this one is 3 times as wide. Or if we set the first one to 0.5, or you actually don't need the 0, just 0.5, it's taking up half of the space of the others. Now, the reason this fraction unit is so cool is the browser is going to do the math for us and automatically account for our column gaps, so on and so forth. So we don't need to do any of that awkward math of saying if we want 3 columns, each one should be 33.3333%. Right? We can just use the fraction unit. So this is great. We have our 3-column layout, but let's not forget about smartphones and small tablets that don't have much horizontal space to work with. What I'm getting at is we absolutely do not want a 3-column layout for smaller screens. So for example, if we look at the reference design, notice that as I resize my browser window to be a bit more narrow, well, it collapses down to a 2-column layout, and then eventually even just a 1-column layout. So again, at this full width, simulating a desktop monitor or a large laptop, there's 3 per row, 2 per row, 1 per row. Whereas if we look at our CodePen, if I zoom in to simulate maybe a smartphone or something that doesn't have much horizontal space to work with, notice how awful this looks. There's just not enough space for us to awkwardly try to force a 3-column layout. You can only fit like 1 word per column. The idea is that we want our layout to be flexible so that for larger screens, maybe we fit 3 per row. For medium-sized screens, maybe we fit 2 per row. And then for tiny screens, we just have 1 feature per row. Now, a few years ago, in order to create an adaptive or responsive layout like this, we would have needed to use something called media queries in CSS. However, nowadays, thanks to Grid, we don't even need media queries to set this up. So check this out. For our grid template columns, let's get rid of this 1FR, 1FR, 1FR value, and instead say repeat, and then a pair of parentheses, and then we give this 2 values. So first you say how many times you want to repeat something. So let's say 4, comma, and then the second value is the width. So maybe 25%. Right? So this is the exact same thing as before when we said 25%, 25%, 25%, 25%. So repeat is just going to take this value and repeat it this many times. So if instead of 25%, if we put this to 1FR and then change the 4 to 3, well, that gives us the exact same layout we had just a moment ago. However, we don't actually need to specifically spell out a number here. So instead of 3, for how many times we want to repeat it, we can just say auto-fit. Now, in combination with 1FR, it's only going to place 1 item per row because that 1 item is getting the full available space. But check this out. If instead of 1FR we said 200 pixels, well, it's just going to place as many items at that size as it can fit. So if we bumped this up to 400 pixels, it's smart enough to realize, well, at 400 pixels, we can only fit 2 per row. right? Or if we bump this up to 800 pixels, it's smart enough to realize you can only fit one. So this is where things get truly interesting. Instead of spelling out an exact value, let's get rid of the 800px and instead say min max and then a pair of parentheses. And now we give this two values. We give it the smallest or minimum width we want them to be. So for example, let's say the smallest we ever want them to be is 300 pixels, comma, the largest we ever want them to be is just 1FR, right? Full screen space. So if I zoom out to resemble a normal desktop monitor, well, this inner area has a max width of 1200 pixels. And since there's a 45 pixel gap here and a 45 pixel gap here, that means there's only room for 3 columns per row. And now if I start to resize my window to be a bit narrower, notice that right around here, it snaps to a 2-column layout instead of 3. This is because right at that threshold, so right here down to here, the browser is detecting that there's no longer enough space for each column to have a minimum width of 300 pixels. Right? The browser is detecting that now, once we get down to this size, well, it could no longer fit 3 per row if each one is required to have a minimum width of 300 pixels. So now we have a 2-column layout, and then if you resize the window to be even smaller, so now this is resembling a smartphone, and now it can figure out that you couldn't even fit 2 per row because there's just not enough space if each one has to be at least 300 pixels wide. Okay, and this means that we have now created the column layout from our reference design. Now before we finish up with a few minor details like the sizing and coloring of this text, I do want to include a few closing words on the topic of grid in CSS. So really quick, if we want to control the spacing in between rows, well, just like grid column gap, we can say grid row gap. Let's say 45px. Okay, and there you can see that taking effect. Now in this particular video, that's all we're going to learn about CSS Grid. Now, grid is an incredibly rich and complex topic, and we have only covered maybe 1 or 2% of what you can do with it. Now, as we've seen in this lesson, even with just this very basic understanding of grid, we can create very useful layouts. However, if you want to learn more about grid, and if this is the sort of thing that interests you and you're really enjoying CSS, and you could see yourself wanting to focus on web design and the way things look visually, then I highly recommend learning more about grid. And right now I want to share with you some of the best and some of my favorite grid videos on YouTube. So I'll include links to these in the description for this video, but I'll just tell you right now. So number 1 is Rachel Andrew. Rachel's YouTube channel is filled with tons of lessons on CSS Grid. Okay, and then number 2 is a YouTube channel named Layout Land, which is created by Jen Simmons. Everything I've learned about CSS Grid I've learned from these 2 channels, and between the 2 of them, they definitely cover both the technical code syntax aspect and sort of the creative or big picture perspective of what's even possible with CSS Grid. Okay, but in this bootcamp series, I don't want to focus too much on the design aspect of things. So for now, let's keep things rolling forward. Let's go ahead and finish up the text styling for these columns, and then let's also, if we look at the reference design, add the small footer down at the bottom. Once we do that, then we can talk about what we're going to cover in our next video. So let's focus on this text styling. In my CSS, I'd create a brand new rule, so dot featured item. Look inside it to style the heading level 3, and I would just say color hashtag 283593 semicolon. Let's say font size 1.5 rem. Let's say font weight normal. Let's get rid of any margin. Okay, looking good. Now let's focus on the paragraphs. So I'd create a new rule, say dot featured item, look inside it for any p elements, curly brackets. Let's get rid of any margin so it can sit a bit closer to the headline. Let's bump up the default line height to maybe 1.6. I almost forgot the semicolon at the end there. New line, let's say color should be a very dark gray, so hashtag 333. Okay, let me zoom out a bit. I think that looks a lot better. Now you might remember that in the reference design there were 9 cool features instead of just the 4 we have here. So off camera right now, I won't bore you with that, but let me copy and paste and add 5 more. Okay, so now I have 9 of the featured item divs. Just a few more closing details. Let's go ahead and add the footer from the reference design. So it's just this little area down here. So in our HTML, down at the very bottom, I'll just create a new div, so div tab. And actually a quick tip I probably should have showed you earlier in the lesson. If you want to create an element, so I just deleted that real quick. If you want to create an element in CodePen with a class, you can actually just say div dot and then the name of the class and then hit tab on your keyboard and that automatically creates it with the class. And I believe div is sort of assumed to be the default item. So if you just say dot footer, hit tab, yep, that's all you need. Okay, inside the footer, let's create a paragraph and let's include the copyright symbol. So that's ampersand, so you hold down shift and then push 7. So ampersand, copy, semicolon, space, and then 2020 fictional company. Okay, so there we see it down in the preview. Now let's style it a bit. So in the CSS, I'll just create a new rule, dot footer, curly brackets. Let's align it in the middle. Now because this div already takes up the full available space and we're just trying to align a piece of text, instead of trying to align a block level element like another div, with text you can actually just say text align :center. But remember that only works for text, not any children div elements or any other children block level elements. Okay, finally let's say padding 20 pixels vertically, we don't need any horizontally. Okay, let's make it a light gray, so color #999. And then finally, let's decrease the font size a little bit. So font size, if 1 rem is sort of the standard, we could say 0.9 rem, semicolon, perfect. At this point, we have successfully recreated the reference design. But really quick, before we bring the lesson to a close, I do want to circle back to our dark purple header, because if you view this on a very tiny screen like a smartphone, well, you can see there might not be enough horizontal space for the navigation links and the logo or header. So if I zoom in even further, you can see it's getting cut off, right? There's just not enough horizontal space. So what we can do is tell that Flexbox area that it's okay to wrap down to a second line if the content won't fit on a single line. So to achieve that, in our CSS, in the rule for our header class, we can just add a new declaration and say flex-wrap and just give it a value of wrap, right? It's okay to drop down to a second line if you need to. So now if I zoom back in again to emulate a tiny device, you can see that once there's no longer enough space to fit on a single row, it just drops down. Now obviously you could fine-tune this styling even further, and if you are very interested in tweaking and perfecting your layout for different screen sizes, you will want to learn about media queries independently from this video. Okay, but big picture, that brings the technical aspect of this lesson to a close. We successfully recreated our reference design. Now let's talk about where we go from here. First, I have to address the fact that in the very first video in this bootcamp series, I said that I'd try to keep the lessons anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes. By the third video, we've already completely destroyed that rule, but oh well. Anyways, where do we go from here? Well, CSS is such a deep topic that we could spend weeks or even months trying to become an expert at CSS, but that's not the point of this bootcamp series. Because yes, some of you watching this series may be interested in web design and the more graphical or visual aspect of things, but I know that a good portion of you watching this are going to be more interested in the programming and servers and database aspects of the series. So here's where we go next. We're not going to worry about becoming an expert at CSS. Our next goal is just to learn how to get out of CodePen. So CodePen is great for experimenting, but eventually you need to start working with real files on your computer. Because imagine if you really liked a web page that you just created in CodePen, and now you want to publish it on a real domain like yourname.com. Well, in order to do that, you would need to stop using CodePen and actually learn how to push files up to a web host or a free service like GitHub. So, before we jump into the programming chapter, I want to close out this design chapter by showing you how to publish a website live up onto the web, not in CodePen, just a regular normal website where the full screen is just your actual web page and you'll have a domain or address that you can share with your friends and family. Because before we dig into programming and servers and databases, I think it's very important to be able to celebrate. And at this point, with your knowledge of HTML and CSS, you're absolutely capable of creating a simple website with a few different pages. And I think actually having it online somewhere where you can share it is going to feel like a big victory worth celebrating. So in our very next lesson, we're going to learn about text editors, which allow us to create files on our computer instead of being so reliant on CodePen. I hope you're enjoying the Bootcamp series so far. If you are, I'd really appreciate it if you could share a link with your friends and family. Anyways, take care, and I'll catch you in the next video.